All media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Welcome to Nowhere to Hyde. I'm Brian Hyde, and you may have noticed this, but there's a lot of talk these days about January 6th. In fact, when the Academy Awards are announced for next year, I would be shocked if we don't see a special category specifically for the January 6th committee hearings, which are being broadcast in prime time by every faithful news organization, and well, at least for the moment is being ignored by Fox and anybody who is not into political melodrama. Political melodrama? Do you think I'm being a little too harsh with that? Well, let me share a clip with you from Tucker Carlson, and you can see how he describes it.
The point is not to get to the truth, it's to hide the truth and to create a pretext for the Democratic Party to declare war against millions of American citizens who oppose their agenda. Liz Cheney is helping them. Here she is just moments ago screeching about disinformation.
President Trump ignored the rulings of our nation's courts. He ignored his own campaign leadership, his White House staff, many Republican state officials. He ignored the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. President Trump invested millions of dollars of campaign funds purposely spreading false information, running ads he knew were false, and convincing millions of Americans that the election was corrupt and that he was the true president. As you will see, this misinformation campaign provoked the violence on January 6th.
She is off on another planet. And, you know, smart person, not an evil person. Why is Liz Cheney abetting the destruction of America's civil liberties, and our sacred norms are being destroyed on the basis of this investigation? Why is she participating in this? Sean Davis has been watching this closely. He's co-founder and CEO of The Federalist, and we're happy to have him tonight. Sean, thanks so much for coming in. What a sad moment this is, and what a strange moment. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I kind of feel like we are watching something akin to the dissolution of the Republic. I mean, we have people who spent the last 4 years with their Russia hoax trying to overthrow the president. They concocted another hoax to make sure a Supreme Court justice they didn't like didn't get confirmed. Then you had the whole COVID thing, which they used as a pretext to just do a massive roll-up of power. Then we have the election, and now they have this committee, which they're using really as a pretext to just criminalize opposition to anything they're doing. It wasn't enough for them to beat Trump. It wasn't enough for them to throw him off of Twitter and ban him from social media. It's apparently not enough for them to go and arrest his top White House advisors while they're getting on planes and putting them in shackles. What they really want to do is criminalize the things that you do, that I do, that everyone watching does when they oppose Democrat policies. I mean, this is kind of an existential threat to how our republic works. If you can't speak out against things, if you can't go vote the way you want about things, if you don't get to run for office without them coming and arresting you, we really don't have a republic anymore. It's a really frightening thing to watch, and they're treating it like it's just like it's show business.
Yeah, I think show business is a really good way to describe this. And the funny thing about it, as the guest there, Sean Davis, points out, these are the folks who won. I mean, you would expect they wouldn't be so angry. I mean, come on, your guy won the election. You would think that would be time for them to calm down and, come on, everybody. The election's over. Now let's just get back to business and let's heal. But no, if anything, they've become even more vehement, even more insistent. They're the things you can't even question. And it's not just a matter of it should be socially shameful to question these things. We want to make it punishable. It's like they want to crush dissent, even the very questions that could lead to dissent. And that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about today. And I want to thank KTVB Television out of Boise for providing us with some wonderful grist for the mill, because they have a story about 6 defendants in the January 6th case. And I'm going to use KTVB's reporting as an example of how the media has approached this from a standpoint of this was a horrible existential crisis, possibly the worst thing since 9/11, worse than Pearl Harbor, certainly in America's history. But I'm also going to point out how there's a lot of sophistry and a lot of weasel words and rhetorical sleight of hand that's used to convince the American public that this is something much, much bigger than it actually was. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not condoning people who did violent or destructive things on January 6th. I know there were people who acted out, but this has been turned from holding those who acted out accountable into smearing roughly half of the voting population as some kind of insurgency or insurrection. I think that's the word that they really like to use. And as you'll see when I share some of these things with you from KTVB television, it's not an accident. The choice of words is just, it's too deliberate. So let's jump right in here. 6 Idaho residents in total have been charged in the riot. Now, I wouldn't disagree. You could probably say that it was a riot, which left 5 people dead, hundreds of police officers injured, and an estimated $1.5 million in damage. All right, the first thing I'm going to call out here is I'm going to question who are these 5 dead, and how exactly did the riot leave them dead? Okay, because by my count, there were actually 4 people who died, at least on the Capitol grounds. Ashley Babbitt, who was shot by a Capitol police officer as she was attempting to enter the chambers there I believe in the Senate. That's one. And as far as I know, that's the only one who it was a violent death. Someone died at another person's hands, and it was a Trump supporter who died at the hands of the Capitol Police, a policeman named Michael Byrd. The other individuals I don't know where they're getting this number 5. There were 3 other individuals who died, a couple of heart attacks, and one person who was either trampled or may have overdosed. I don't know for sure, but my point is, of the 4 people who died on the Capitol grounds, to my knowledge, all of them were Trump supporters. Now, we're left to wonder, well, 5 people died. I'm sure that must include police officers. Most of us heard claims that Officer Brian Sicknick was killed, beat over the head with a fire extinguisher or something like that. And only those who looked beyond the headlines and actually did their due diligence and looked at the story learned later that no, actually Officer Brian Sicknick died a couple of days after the disturbance at the Capitol, and it was from a stroke. Now that's sad and that's tragic, but I have to wonder why the need to exploit it, why to report it in such a way that it's not clear, who died or what the cause of death was. All we know is it was a deadly insurrection. But I think they're straining the limits of credulity to report it like that. The attack began the afternoon of January 6, 2021, when scores of supporters of former President Donald Trump stormed the Capitol building, clashing violently with Capitol Police and smashing their way inside in an attempt to stop Congress from certifying the results of the 2020 election, which current President Joe Biden won by more than 7 million individual votes and 74 electoral college votes. Okay, some of them, I don't know if they were trying to stop the certification. I know that there were some who were advancing the idea that maybe some of those electoral votes were illicit and should not be counted until a thorough investigation had taken place. But it's interesting that KTVB brings up the 7 million votes, by more than 7 million votes. Guys, those 7 million votes, they don't count. It could have been 24 million votes. It could have been 300 million votes. But the president is not elected by popular election. It's done through the Electoral College. Now, those 74 Electoral College votes, okay, let's talk about those. Because questions remain whether those 74 votes, primarily from 5 swing states in which counting of the votes stopped all at the same time, and then mysteriously resumed a few hours later, where suddenly, boom, there was way more votes than there had been going into that halt of voting, or that halt of counting, I should say. Now, that's a little bit suspicious. And it doesn't mean that I know for sure the election was stolen, but I'm saying to pretend that, well, it was such a decisive victory and everybody knew, there are some legitimate questions that need to be asked, and you don't have to commit fully to the election was stolen to be willing to say, yeah, there's some smoke there. Maybe we should look around and see if there was fire. I point out appealing to the numbers. Well, he won the popular vote. Doesn't matter. And as far as the electoral vote, if you haven't seen the movie 2,000 Mules by Dinesh D'Souza, I'm not saying it's going to convince you that the election was stolen, but you'll certainly understand why questions remain as to whether or not there was ballot box stuffing or whether there was some kind of manipulation on the part of those who were, trusted to count the votes. So the breach interrupted the electoral count, with rioters threatening Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and erecting a gallows to lynch then Vice President Mike Pence. I doubt this, and let me tell you why. Look, public figures or political figures hanged in effigy, you can expect to see that kind of thing around political protests. Now, primarily, I've seen this in other countries, but I believe it can happen here too. I've even seen, at least at some left-wing protests here in America, people putting mock-ups, and actually I've seen this at a right-wing one too, people putting a mock-up of a guillotine there. And do I just wonder, do we have a little fetish with the French Revolution or something? I don't know. A bunch of neo-Jacobins out there, trying to use some of the symbols of what the French Revolution was represented by. But if there was an actual gallows, and I mean something that functionally could have been used to murder the vice president, do you not think that wouldn't have been on the front page of every paper and been in the news videos nonstop since January 6th? It's very sensational. Oh my gosh, they went there to kill the vice president. I'd like to see some proof, and not just the idea that they constructed a gallows and therefore that's what it was. The attempted coup, interesting choice of words, was unsuccessful, and the certification process continued after law enforcement regained control of the building, ultimately confirming Biden as the victor. Why do we use the word coup? I mean, do you want to know what a coup looks like, or at least what a real legit insurrection looks like? I would ask you to think back to Afghanistan back at the end of last summer. Armed people, heavily armed people, by force, taking government buildings, dead politicians laying in the street, people forced out of power. Yeah, that's what it looks like. Now, what we saw at the Capitol was certainly not good behavior on the part of those who forced their way in and then paraded around and waved flags and made statements and tried to shoplift, furniture from Nancy Pelosi's office. But to call it a coup, I think, is overstating things by quite some stretch. And as we look into some of the actual charges that these 6 defendants from Idaho are facing or have faced, I'm going to defy you to find the word coup or the word insurrection or even, terrorism in those charges. It's just more hyperbole, more of an attempt to paint this as such a despicable, horrific event that by necessity we have to crack down on anyone who disagrees because this dissent is so dangerous. And I believe that's really the purpose behind this whole January 6th spectacle. By the way, the idea that the certification process continued after law enforcement regained control of the building, you do realize there is ample video of law enforcement officers after the first few people had forced their way in, stepping aside, removing the velvet rope, if you will, and waving people into the building. In fact, a lot of the people who found themselves charged with offenses for January 6th were people who simply followed the crowd into the building. I mean, they were there to go in and have a look around, and maybe they knew that, this isn't really right, but it's not like, oh my gosh, this bloodthirsty mob forced their way in, and therefore, they were the government was about to topple. The government most certainly was not about to topple. Now listen to this. Many of those charged in the events of January 6th, including a number of the Idaho defendants, say they believed falsehoods about voter fraud and the 2020 election being stolen. Okay, I'm going to walk that one back for a minute. They said that in their own words. I believed stories of falsehoods about voter fraud and the election being stolen. That was in quotation marks. See, I think there's a better way that this could have been stated that doesn't carry nearly as much editorial. I mean, we are real journalists here, right, KTVB? You are journalists and not trying to apply judgment or otherwise emotional manipulation to the content you're reporting, right? So what if you said it this way? Many of those charged in the events of January 6th, including a number of the Idaho defendants, say they believed allegations about voter fraud and the 2020 election being stolen. It's still the same thing. It's still true. They believed that it was alleged that there was voter fraud. They believed that the 2020 election was being stolen, but you don't need those quotation marks for stolen. See, to me, this is an example of media stating something with certainty, distorting something actually with certainty, as if Though these people knew it was falsehoods, but they went in there anyway and did it. Oh, and by the way, the next thing here. In fact, exhaustive bipartisan investigations found no evidence of widespread fraudulent voting or ballot tampering anywhere in the U.S. I'd like to see somebody quantify exactly what is meant by exhaustive bipartisan investigations, because from the very beginning, it was forbidden. Any politician who wanted to basically keep his or her skin intact was told, you cannot question the results of this election. And those who did, well, they were shamed and they were, essentially virtually pilloried for daring to do so. No, there were some half-hearted efforts. There were, and look, there were some things that were, I think, doomed. Like I'm looking in Rudy Giuliani's direction going, what was that? We're going to release the Kraken. There were big promises made. We have the proof. We have the smoking gun that never really materialized. But no court that I'm aware of, no, strike that, one court that I'm aware of actually gave a complete hearing to whether or not the votes in that particular state, I believe this was Pennsylvania, had been inappropriately taken. And you know what they ruled? They actually came down in favor of the people who were challenging whether or not those votes had been inappropriately counted. But then it went to an appeals court, which overturned the original decision. Every other time, though, even right up to the Supreme Court, judges stepped aside. They would not listen to these cases, and it was always on some technicality. This I was not dotted, that T was not crossed, and through some procedural measure, they threw out the majority of those cases. They were not given a fair hearing. Now, this didn't stop people from doing their due diligence, and again, I'm going to tip my hat to Dinesh D'Souza. 2,000 mules definitely raises some very serious questions about whether there was fraudulent voting, as in ballot box stuffing or ballot tampering in the U.S. I'm not here to convince you that, oh, absolutely there was. I'm just saying, if you actually are enough of a truth seeker that you would be willing to consider something other than what's being spoon-fed to you by a bunch of blow-dried, highly paid spinmeisters in the mainstream media, you might come to a different conclusion than from what the one that they're telling you you have to believe. It's just not that cut and dried. Now, I don't know that my goal here today is to try to convince you so much that, the election was stolen, because I don't know that for a fact. What I'm trying to convince you is that it's worth asking these questions regardless of how angry some people are, whether it's Liz Cheney or whether it's Charlie Schumer or Nancy Pelosi. It doesn't matter. We are residents and citizens of a republic. I know they like to say it's a democracy. Our democracy was about to fall, but we live in a constitutional republic. And that means government is supposed to be accountable to the citizenry. And when government is doing things which are harmful to the citizens, either through the denial of their natural rights or through just outright oppressive or harmful policies, and I think the guest on Tucker Carlson there alluded to several of them, the COVID mitigation efforts and so forth, it's our job to ask questions. Now, I'm not saying that you need to act out violently. In fact, I don't recommend it. But to try to conflate anyone who questions with someone who's acting out violently, I'm sorry, that's the actions of control freaks and tyrants. And right now, the control freaks are very, very angry with people who ask those kinds of questions because it's proof that we're not under their control. So, where do we go from here? Well, let's take a look at the defendants from Idaho. And I want you to pay very close attention because this sounds like a very, very serious thing. I mean, come on, all the primetime networks are carrying this. It's so important. I mean, why the very future of our democracy hangs on it. But I want you to listen closely to the things that these people were actually charged with. We start with Josiah Colt. In an interview with KTVB following his arrest, Colt said he had not hurt anyone in the Capitol and was sorry for his role in the siege. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of an official proceeding, a felony. In July 2021, he's due to appear in court for a status conference on December 14th. Okay, obstruction to an official proceeding. Now, look, I know the political class has a very high opinion of itself, and whether or not that should rise to a felony level, well, I guess if they have a high enough opinion of themselves, perhaps it would. But I'd like to see what exactly that constitutes. Obstruction of an official proceeding. My goodness, that's so serious. You should lose your right to vote and your right to own a firearm and probably go to jail for years and years. To me, that sounds like toxic levels of self-importance on the part of politicians. But, That's hardly unexpected. Duke Wilson, the second Idahoan to plead guilty in the sprawling criminal case. 68-year-old Duke Wilson of Nampa was sentenced to over 4 years in prison earlier this year. Now, Wilson admitted to assaulting a federal officer and obstructing an official proceeding in the failed coup. Now, assaulting an officer, that is a pretty serious thing. According to the FBI, he hit a police officer with a PVC pipe. That's a plastic pipe. May all your enemies be armed with plastic pipes instead of metal or lead ones. Punched and pushed others to the ground and assisted a crowd in wrenching a riot shield away from an officer who was being overwhelmed by rioters in the lower West Terrace tunnel of the U.S. Capitol. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. How about Pam Hemphill? Pam was sentenced to serve 2 months in jail and 3 years probation in May as part of a plea agreement with federal prosecutors. Senior Judge Royce Lambert of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia on Tuesday sentenced Pamela Hemphill for one misdemeanor count of demonstrating, parading, or picketing in the U.S. Capitol building. 3 other counts were dropped under the plea agreement. In addition to jail and probation, the judge ordered Hemphill to pay $500 restitution. I don't know if you're aware of this, but do you know that 97% of the time defendants are found guilty in federal court? When they are charged criminally with something, there is a 97% conviction rate. Now, you may want to ask yourself, why is it? Is it because federal prosecutors are that good? I mean, they're just that one step below God and they know everything and they have it all down? I think it's more a matter of they tend to overcharge. They tend to throw all kinds of crazy charges at people just to see what sticks. They threaten, with years and years of prison. The penalties for federal, crimes always seem to have real teeth in them. And so it's not too hard to understand why defendants will take a plea deal when they're facing, many, decades even in prison, as opposed to a few years in jail and maybe a fine or something like that. But more than anything, the reason that the federal government has such a high conviction rate is because it has almost unlimited time and resources in order to prosecute those cases. So they can grind people down and they can make it work. Going back to Pam Hemphill for just a moment here. The judge ordered her to pay $500 restitution. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think the fact that she was charged with a misdemeanor count of demonstrating, parading, or picketing in the U.S. Capitol building, I don't know that any of those things were inappropriate. But what I do want you to consider is, where is the insurrection charge, right? I mean, where is something that would justify why there has been this huge investigation, why this is taking up primetime television, why 800 people have been arrested? A number of them have languished in a D.C. jail for more than a year awaiting trial. Again, just a few questions that people who are still tethered to reality may want to ask themselves. Here's Yvonne St. Cyr, charged with knowingly entering or remaining in any restricted building or grounds without lawful authority and violent entry and disorderly conduct on Capitol grounds, both misdemeanors. St. Cyr had been arrested in Boise the month before the coup for refusing to leave the Central District Health Building during a protest about coronavirus precautions. Now, some people may think, well, that's a negative. She was arrested before. Why? She must be a career criminal. You know what that tells me about her? This is a person who takes very seriously when government is infringing upon her rights. And look, I'm not suggesting you need to go out there and get yourself arrested so you got some street cred. But the things for which a person can get arrested are ridiculous. If you're familiar with Sarah Brady, the mom in Meridian who was arrested at a park for taking her kids for a play date, that's a good example of this. It's not a sure sign. To bring that up is just to try to poison people about, well, she was arrested before, and by calling it coronavirus precautions. Can I just remind you that those precautions, as KTVB is styling them, were actually orders from unelected, unaccountable health department bureaucrats, but enforced with the power of law, which were depriving people of their livelihoods, depriving people of their mental health, and restricting their ability to earn a living, restricting their ability to worship at church, to do anything without official government permission. And the worst part of that, the absolute insult to injury, is those silly restrictions did nothing to mitigate the spread of the coronavirus. It did what viruses are going to do, regardless of what these health officials were saying. Masks, mandates, forced closures, essential versus non-essential, did nothing to stop the pathway of the virus. It did what every other virus before it has done. It spread through the population until it was endemic, and then the variants became less and less of a concern. All right. Let's talk about another defendant here. And again, I'm still looking for these words, of insurrection or terrorism or something that would justify, the wholesale, we must limit people's liberties because this is so dangerous. Your civil rights have to go away. Michael Pope turned himself in February 12th, 2021. He was charged with felony counts of obstructing, impeding official proceedings and civil disorder, as well as misdemeanor counts of entering and remaining in a restricted building or grounds, disorderly and disruptive conduct in a restricted building or grounds, disorderly conduct in a Capitol building, impeding passage through the Capitol grounds or buildings, and parading, demonstrating, or picketing in a Capitol building. Pretty much the same thing here for Tyler 2, charged with misdemeanor counts of entering and remaining in a restricted building or grounds, disorderly and disruptive conduct in a restricted building or grounds, disorderly conduct in a Capitol building, and parading, demonstrating, or picketing in a Capitol building. Now, look, maybe it sounds like I'm taking this lightly, and I don't mean to make fun here, but do you realize you can get arrested for simply dancing at the Jefferson Monument? Oh, don't believe me? Adam Kokesh and a group of people went to prove just how far federal law enforcement would go to enforce some of these ridiculous rules. And when I say they were dancing, I mean, they weren't break dancing and they weren't grinding on one another. They were simply holding one another and swaying back and forth with a little bit of music playing, and the cops arrested them. So when we talk about disorderly conduct, just understand, it sounds so very serious, but oftentimes it's really not. And here's the other thing that comes to mind is, what about the questions that aren't being answered by these January 6th proceedings? Don't you think we deserve a few answers to questions like, will the committee release 14,000 hours of surveillance video to show what happened inside and outside the Capitol building on January 6th? Did you know that the Capitol Police erased all of the footage from January 5th? Now, why would that matter? Well, the claim is from this committee that, Republican leaders were there inside the Capitol doing a reconnaissance mission beforehand. But instead, Biden's Justice Department quickly designated the footage as highly sensitive government material that remains under strict protective orders in court proceedings. This is according to Julie Kelly in American Greatness, an article published earlier this week. Also, where are the internal investigative reports on police misconduct on January 6th? Will the committee make public the inquiry into the police killing of Ashley Babbitt? What about the 3 other fatalities that day? Again, Democrats continually describe January 6th as a deadly insurrection, but the only people who died were Trump supporters. Also, will the committee, speaking of the FBI, will the committee disclose how many undercover agents and informants were in any way involved with January 6th? Reporting by the New York Times last year confirmed at least 2 informants infiltrated the Proud Boys months before and were among the first to breach the perimeter of the grounds. Bundy Ranch, the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, the so-called militia governor kidnapping plot. A closer look at every one of these stories reveals federal informants out the wazoo, agents operating undercover, and confidential informants and provocateurs were a part of this. It's not unreasonable to ask whether these kind of things took place on January 6th. And when you look at the people who were actually involved in committing the break-ins into the Capitol, this wasn't just the crowd, seizing the moment. These were people who clearly had training in what they were doing. Be kind of nice to know who they were. Other questions that remain. Who is Ray Epps and why was he removed from the FBI's most wanted list? Let me play a very short clip of who Ray Epps is, and you'll see why there should be some more interest on him.
We need to go into the Capitol. Into the Capitol. What? No! Peacefully. Fed. Tomorrow? I don't even like to say it because I'll be arrested.
Well, let's not say it.
We need to go. I'll say it.
All right.
We need to go in.
Shut the boomer.
To the Capitol. Base fed.
We need to go into the Capitol. I didn't see that coming. Okay.
Monument Hill. The president is not speaking. We are going to the Capitol, where our problems are. It's that direction. Please spread the word.
All right. Noted.
Okay, but one more thing.
Yeah, so can we go up there?
No? When we go in. Are we going to get arrested if we go up there? Yeah. You don't need to get shot. You arrest us all?
Okay, you can see for yourself, Ray Epps was front and center for all of it. And yet he was on the FBI's most wanted list and then suddenly, quietly removed. We also would like to know, why did Nancy Pelosi refuse to honor a request from the Capitol Police Chief requesting National Guard troops and additional security for January 6th? I wouldn't mind knowing who exactly is working to subvert this republic of ours. And is this January 6th show trial all about criminalizing all political dissent? Because it's really starting to look that way. Now, if you are a person who is willing to look beyond the narrative and its managers, and willing to look beyond even the meager, evidence or the meager suggestions that I'm making here today, I'm going to suggest a source that could really provide some insight. And it's revolver.news. They have done some of the most comprehensive analysis and reporting on this. And I mean real investigative reporting, as in actually looking at what the people in power have said and done. But their focus isn't just on the people in power. They go through many, many hours of video. And again, I'm not going to tell you, this is going to convince you, yes, that January 6th was a false flag. But you will definitely see that they are showing there are some huge inconsistencies, huge gaps in the way that this is being reported. And that should matter, because the only thing that's at stake here is your civil liberties and mine. Let me close with an encouraging thought, because there are people who will want you to feel bad for even questioning such a thing. My friend Kent McManigal puts it very simply. Don't let anyone make you feel bad about refusing to go along with your own enslavement. Understanding, respecting, and exercising liberty doesn't make you a bad person. And he's right. I'm going to warn you, if you stand up and you ask these kind of questions, you're going to be called names. You're going to be made to suffer for your beliefs. The question is, do you have beliefs that are worth suffering for? And if the answer is no, then you probably should consider getting yourself some better beliefs. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
Indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.